What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Octopath Traveler 0. Honestly, kind of an odd game in the series in the sense that it is essentially a retelling of a mobile game, minus all the gacha stuff, and so it's like just a full regular title. That brings with it some good things and some slightly more frustrating things. Now, as many people know, I review games this way all the time. There's a video linked below covering everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. To that end, it is also important that I tell you that while we are almost 2 weeks after the game officially launched, I did receive a review key for this game. It was just on the day the game launched, and so it took me a while to get around to it, but that likely would have been the case anyway because this game is quite long. The main story took me about 70-ish hours, and there's still a good chunk of content after that to get through, and combine that with some news that I dropped everything to cover from the Game Awards, this took a minute. Let's talk about this game a little more generally first. So, like I said, this is essentially a retelling of a mobile game called Octopath Traveler Champions of the Continent. I have not personally played that version of the game, but from what I understand, this is mostly a pretty accurate retelling of what happened there, with the only really new content mostly being around town building and the like. Now, despite this sort of odd beginning, the game is interesting in the sense that it does some things I really enjoy, and there are some things that I find frustrating that are likely due to its existence as a mobile game first. So things like the character creation being present, or even just the town building, is a fairly enjoyable experience that I think adds a bit to the overall series. I like the way they handled learning different skills for individual characters to make progression a bit more rewarding, things like that. However, it also has some serious problems that make this a bit of a mixed bag for me personally, which mostly comes down to the fact that there are simply way too many characters to get deeply involved with each one of them. The playable characters in this game, I think there's 35 of them, and so many of them are clearly just throwaways that don't actually matter. In some ways, it actually kind of reminds me strangely of Baldur's Gate 1, where there's actually a bunch of pre-generated companions you can take along in that game, but outside of their introduction, they really don't have too much else to say. Now, many of these characters are returning characters from other games, so technically they got a little bit more detail there. However, by and large, I just don't think it really works. There's also the fact that the story is kind of disjointed and told in a strange way that, while not exactly new for the Octopath Travelers series, is just even more egregious here because of its beginnings as a mobile game. In some ways, it almost feels like you're playing through several different games that have just kind of been taped together. In fact, there's one point halfway through the game where the credits roll, but you're not even close to done with the main story. So, in short, I think for the most part, if you enjoy Octopath Traveler generally, you'll likely enjoy this, but I don't think it's as good as 2, and it has some annoyances. And with that, let's talk about the technical state of this game. So, I didn't have any substantial problems, things that would actually keep you from playing the game or anything. However, I did notice something pretty early on, even from my impressions video, that this release version of the audio is odd, basically. It's kind of just mixed in a strange way, where there are different levels of audio all the time. Sometimes battle music would strangely be super loud for no reason. Other times, random bits of dialogue would just sound really compressed. And while that hardly makes the game unplayable or anything, it's mostly just strange. From there, let's talk a little bit about character creations. So something a little bit different about this game is that you'll actually get to customize your own sprite and everything. And for the record, the cosmetic portion of this can be changed later via the town building. You'll get access to a building that can change your appearance, things like that. But even then, there are some things like your learned skill. This is a skill you will start the game with, though to be clear, you will be able to get skills later, so this is just a starting point. You'll also get to pick a favorite dish that comes up several times in conversations and stuff like that, which is kind of fun. And then you'll also get to pick 3 different belongings to start the game with. Now, 2 of these I would highly recommend you grab are the crested key and the letter fragment. You can get them if you don't pick them here. To be clear, it's just a little more annoying if you don't. So something to know, I suppose. From there, you, of course, give your character a name and get the story kicked off properly. But let's talk a little bit about that story setup. So this is kind of an interesting one because, as I mentioned, there are multiple different stories being told here. But the gist of it is, very broadly, our character hails from a town called Wishvale, Wishvale is the target of a plot by 3 villains to encounter these rings. That's what they are looking for, and they ultimately burn your town down in search of one of these rings. You'll find out these rings are the Divine Rings, which grant people large amounts of power if they can actually get their hands on them. You yourself get access to the Flamebringer's Ring, one of the rings that will only allow certain wearers, those pure of heart, which is why it chose you. And your job is basically to claim justice or vengeance on the people that ultimately burn down your town, while at the same time gathering up rings and hopefully neutralizing the threat. That occurs across the entirety of the various story bits that we'll get to. The first segment of the story is you tracking down the 3 characters that actually burned your town down. That's like the initial, let's say 25% or so of the game. That is followed up by the Master of All story, which is where the Scholar King, as he's known, uses the rings to wage war against several other nations. And that story is honestly really long, but the other stories that happen after this are where things start to come into focus a little bit, as you'll start tracking down other villains who have taken up some of the rings. And once you have them all, as you go to seal them, unsurprisingly, some more stuff pops up, which leads to the final chapters, which see you in hell, and is where you can track down the rest of the stuff and actually start managing to finish some things. Now, this is interesting because there is the basic version of the ending, and once you've completed that, there's several optional bosses you can track down and fight that can lead you to the true ending. And then once that's done, you can finally go track down and fight the super boss if you like. Now, my main takeaway from the story is that while individual portions of it are good, it's just not a story that respects a lot of your time. Especially since just about every one of these plot threads introduces potentially 20 new people and expects you to remember them, but then also you have to go do this other story which is separate and has its own characters, and it's just a lot to keep track of. And the game tries to help you with this by letting you replay, story cutscenes, that kind of thing, via the journal, but ultimately, I would say that it gets off to a strong start, and it actually does finish pretty strong once everything comes together. But there's a good chunk of the middle there, like the Master of All and the first 3 legs of the Bestower of All story are just incredibly long and dull. And there is kind of a payoff there in the end, especially with some of the characters who come into their own, but it just takes so long to get there. And I think it's not helped by the fact that we just have so many different characters, and they're all pretty disconnected. Many of them aren't even connected to the main plot much at all, and then the ones that are connected to the main plot are divided up against all these different fragmented stories that make the main story. And it's not awful or anything, but completing this game's story was just a real test of patience. From there, let's talk some progression. So there is a lot of progression in this game, like many a JRPG, everything down to, for your main character, things like their jobs specifically, levels, skills, the ones you can learn, and then the ones you'll be equipping, various characters, that is to say, recruiting them. And that's before we even start talking about things like gear. So your main character is a bit of a universalist. Other characters that you recruit will have a set job that they learn, whereas your character can learn from all of the base level jobs, with the exclusion of that some late game characters mostly have unique jobs and skills that only they get to use. So even just who can do what is pretty varied. Now, the way they get around this is with the skills that you can learn and equip. So every job, that is to say every character, has set skills that are part of their base kit. You'll unlock those as you earn job points from various battles. As you unlock main skills, you'll unlock support skills to go with them. And then lastly, you can unlock the ultimate for those characters once you've gotten to a point in, I think it's the town building actually, that enables it. Once you've built up a training arena, you'll eventually get to learn ultimate skills, which is a huge part of combat in the late game. There's also the element of just recruiting these characters to begin with. They often are the part of side stories, stuff like that. You'll have to go track them down to pull them into your party. But the other part of the skills that you'll learn from all these people is that once you have cleared out the main and support skills for a character, you can start spending job points on effectively turning those skills into a version of an item. That character will have them as a base, but you can spend an ever-increasing amount of job points to take one of those skills, turn it into an equipable skill that other characters will then be able to equip to their support slots if they have used job points to unlock the slots that allow them to do that. It might not seem like it, but this is actually really important, especially in the late game, because this is how you're going to do things like break the damage cap, which is arguably the most important use of this system, and frustratingly hidden, by the way. So there is a support skill that will let you break the damage cap from 9,999 to 99,999. That was frustrating because that support skill is tied to like a single random recruitable guy, and you have to get his very last support skill, which is hidden before you even realize that's what it is. And this guy's fairly deep into the game, meaning that not only do you have to find and recruit this guy, but then you also have to completely outfit a dude you're probably not using to discover the support skill that is integral to some of the later game battles. I don't like the way they handled that at all, especially since I tried to do most of this without a guide. There was some stuff towards the end that I looked up, and this was actually one of them, because I was like, man, these battles are taking forever. I'm doing something wrong. And yeah, apparently one of the guys I had recruited like 30 hours ago had the support skill for this, and the game does not do anything to tell you that. Which wouldn't be a problem, except there's 35 recruitable characters, and I didn't go through the support skills for anything beyond the 8-man party I was using at the time. So it's a little bit my fault, I'll grant you, but that was obtuse. But we're far from done, because you might just think to yourself, hey, that's a lot of recruitable characters. How does the game handling gearing them out? Well, the answer is expensively. Another reason you're more than likely to stick to the early characters that you like is the fact that in order for these guys to be effective, you realistically need to put gear on them, and trying to outfit every character in your party at the same time is extraordinarily expensive. Now, for the most part, this isn't a big deal. You stick to your main party, upgrading those guys, totally fine. Except randomly towards the very end of the game, there is one boss where you use every single character you have recruited, and the trick there is that while it's not a terribly difficult fight, you're probably going to have to spend some time finding some gear for all these characters, because if they're outfitted in their base stuff, they're just going to get obliterated. Which means something that hasn't been a problem for the entirety of the game up to that point, I now have to go grind out a bunch of cash to correct for a single fight buried at the very end of the game. And it's just incredibly frustrating, and it's another point where I'm like, there's just too many characters here, and they don't add anything to the experience. Last but not least, there is then also the progress on rebuilding your town. So a big part of this game, and this thing that's new to it really, is rebuilding the town that is burnt down at the beginning, Wishvale. This starts off pretty slow, and you don't necessarily have to do a good chunk of it right away, but it's important to mention that a lot of quality of life stuff is actually tied behind building up your town. This is where you will be able to build like a training facility to put some of the characters you are not using into training so they're still leveling up and earning job points while you're running around. It's where you can put up a trading building. That one's actually really important for a lot of like achievements and stuff, because one of the things you can get in this game are trade lists, which will basically give you a rotating version of goods that come in and out of your town based on places you have been and explored. There are several like random things you have to wait for to show up in that shop. Later on, there's also a flame that you can kindle, which gives you access to a lot of convenience features like fast traveling to wilderness areas, talking to animals, or being able to see like exactly how many chests and elite enemies you still have to take down. So suffice to say, there's a lot of important progression tied to the town building, and overall, I would not recommend ignoring it. Which then brings us to the gameplay and world section of this video. So Octopath Traveler 0 has quite a bit of exploration. There is a fairly big explorable world here, but this is a section of the game where you can certainly feel the sort of mobile nature of it, as a lot of the individual areas are quite small, and the dungeons you find yourself in are often quite simple, even in comparison to like other stuff in the series. That's not to say there's not some fun ones. I was a really big fan of the Golden Palace area. The final dungeon, I guess you could call it, is made up of several different areas that I thought were pretty fun to explore, and those dungeons are interesting because they're a little more involved than the other ones, which are mostly just you running through small areas doing the occasional random encounter. Now, outside of those zones you find yourself in, we also have towns. This is where you can do the obvious stuff, run in, heal, save, outfit your characters, that kind of thing. It's also where, as you would probably imagine, most of the side quests and stuff come up, but the way you interact with most characters is part of the path action system. Path actions are relatively simple here in comparison to something like Octopath Traveler 2, because your main character is really the only person doing them. Which is as good a time as any to mention that much of the game is themed around fame, power, and wealth. We actually see this in stats that we'll raise as we do and complete content. Basically, the more content you clear, the more these stats go up, and these stats are what influence your ability to perform path actions with given townsfolk. Most of this is going to be like inquiring about just general knowledge, which can advance certain conversations, but there's also stuff like purchasing items from random NPCs, just asking them to give it to you, or fighting them for it, that general kind of stuff. And things like that sort of act as the backbone of a lot of your interactions with general folk. But the thing is, as I mentioned, these are toned down from Octopath Traveler 2, and the fact that there's not a day-night cycle in this game either also means there's less to interact with here, and overall it's a simpler system than we've seen elsewhere in the series. It's fine for what it is, just pointing it out. Now, there's also the ability to later on get a ship that will allow you to sail around and do a little bit of water exploration. This is not super involved, honestly. You just find the ship, pay for it, and then you get to explore some relatively small water areas, which led to a lot less content than I was really expecting it to, all told, though. Outside of just those generic things, some of the late game stuff that you can get up to is, like, for instance, finding the hidden town of Agapia, which is actually really missable. You have to find a journal in the final dungeon that will lead you on a little side quest to actually go get it. If you get all the letter fragments, you can access one of the islands that gets you what is probably going to be one of the last companions you recruit just because of how much stuff you have to do to get them. Or you can start fighting civilians for the battle-tested weapons, which is also pretty funny. There are hardened warriors throughout the land, and many of them have the best in-slot weapons for most people, and in order to get them, you have to go fight those people and defeat them, which is honestly more difficult than you might imagine because some of them have higher health totals than the actual bosses you will be facing. Speaking of bosses and fighting things, let's talk a bit about combat. One of the more interesting things this game does is use an 8-character party system for combat. Now, this is interesting because honestly, most of the game is really easy because of it. You can win a lot of encounters just through sheer numbers. However, some important things to know. Your 8 characters are divided between your front and back row. You get 4 turns per round. However, on that turn, you can use the character in front or the character in back, and you can swap freely between them. Some bosses late in the game actually take advantage of this by, conferring status effects on certain people in line or not letting you switch, stuff like that. It does come up later, but the vast majority of the game does not do that. Now, the reason this is so kind of balance breaking for much of the game is the fact that our characters still function the way they do in the other Octopath games with the break system. So when you're fighting enemies, your goal basically is to find their weaknesses, hit them with that weakness until it breaks their shield, which puts them into a stun state and takes their turn. Every turn that passes without boosting, your character gains a boost point. Boost points typically allow you to either use a weapon more than once, up to a maximum of 4 hits per turn, or empower spells to do more damage, that kind of thing. But the catch is, one of the most convenient ways to use these boost points is to hit weaknesses for more numbers of times than you typically would. And if you are set up and have the ability to actually hit those weaknesses, and then use the boost points, you can quickly break through an enemy's shields. However, having an 8-character party that you can freely swap between per spot, but also that they gain boost points independently of one another, means that it is possible to set up a scenario where you are breaking an enemy's shield every time they have them without the ability to fight back, which then lets you use powered up skills and hits against them while they are sitting there defenseless. Because of just, again, the number of characters we have and how that works, I found this to be substantially easier than Octopath Traveler 2, and that wasn't a particularly difficult game either outside of Galdera. Now, the early game, early to mid-game, I guess, before we start unlocking the break damage cap and our ultimates, that is more or less how it's going to go. But the late game is even more simple than that because it's basically maximizing damage and using your ultimates. Every character has an ultimate. Your main character gets several different ones based on the rings you have acquired, but as you use your boost points in combat, you earn your ultimate gauge, and there's also ways to fill this super easy that you can discover, like using items to fill it, using support and equipable skills that will fill it faster, that kind of thing. And this is important because once you've broken the damage cap especially, several characters have ultimates that will easily deal the actual damage cap of 99,999. And believe it or not, even most of the in-game bosses are simply not ready for you to lean completely into that. That is to say, breaking the damage cap and then just spamming ultimates with these ultimate gauge techniques, basically. So you'll quickly break their defenses, ideally, or sometimes you don't even have to do that, and then just like spam these super ultimates at an enemy, and like even some of the in-game bosses only have like 400k health, and You hit them 3 or 4 times this way and they're pretty much dead. So on one hand, there is a satisfying bit of gameplay loop there where it's fun to like get an idea of how this works, but it takes so long for enemies to even like adjust or accommodate it. That is to say, start using abilities that might prevent you from switching or actively affect like an entire line of your people, that kind of thing. It just takes so long for the enemies to get to that point that you're probably going to dominate most of combat even without grinding. You don't need to be like massively over-leveled to take advantage of this stuff. So all in all, combat's fun enough for what it is, but it didn't exactly wow me. I think if they're going to continue with this 8-character party stuff, they need to probably balance it a little better in the future if this is something they want to continue to do. It's fun, but it's just too easy. The last thing I want to mention on combat before we move on, the end of this game is just a ridiculous boss gauntlet. This isn't anything about combat specifically, more of just a general complaint about the way the end of the run is structured. It's basically like a couple of random encounters as you move from area to area, and then it's just boss after boss after boss. I'm not even kidding when I say it's like a dozen of them. And fighting that many bosses back to back on the back of a story that is, again, fragmented and very long is just a real slog of a way to end a very long game. And while not terribly difficult, it is exhausting after a while. But that brings us to our Steam Deck section before we start wrapping this thing up, and that is going to be an officially verified Steam Deck rating. If you couldn't tell by looking at this game, it is not exactly graphically demanding, and the Steam Deck runs stuff like this very, very well. This is a great game to run on the Steam Deck. It plays very well there. Would highly recommend it if you want to play it on that platform. You should be good to go. It's got all the things you want. Controller support, cloud saves, all the usual stuff. No reason not to play it there. But that brings us to our positives, negatives, and then we'll wrap this thing up. On the positive side, there's quite a few things I do like about Octopath Traveler 0. I liked the character creation. I liked being able to put like a version of my own sprite and then customize who that character is, even more so than the others. I found myself weirdly into the town building. That's not usually the kind of thing I enjoy about these games, and while, it's not like an incredible system or anything, I did genuinely have fun decorating Wishvale. I think the game starts off really strong story-wise. I think a lot of the individual stories are pretty decent. And I think the ending is really great if you can tough it out and get to the end of this game. And while combat was hardly difficult or anything, I do enjoy like the basic weakness and break system and then capitalizing on that. And there's a lot of fun ways to interact with that, especially with 8 characters. So while it's not hard, it is fun. And I think that's probably the more important thing to be honest. However, I do have a lot of negatives for this, which is why I'm kind of mixed on this one personally. For starters, there's just too many characters. So many of these characters do not matter. They don't get much development at all. I think they would have been better served by just picking a core cast and sticking with it rather than shoehorning all of these guys in here. They just don't add enough. It's a pain to keep up with all of them. And then randomly you have a single fight that actually lets you use all of them at once, which was also not fun because you probably haven't geared all of them up because you don't need to do that in any other context. Which brings me to another point. The game is filled with a lot of little stuff that makes it feel like it just doesn't really respect your time, and that's likely because it was a port of a mobile game at the end of the day. We've got the fragmented story, more so than the other Octopath games, mind you. They all, technically speaking, have kind of a fragmented story, but in this particular instance, it really does feel like several games stitched together in a sort of patchwork fashion that just doesn't quite work the way it does elsewhere. There's also the audio issue. I'm not wildly worried about that personally, but if I notice it's bad, and I don't even talk about audio that much, it's not great, and that's likely to be fixed, but it's also not game-breaking either. Then there's also the places where this feels like a step back from Octopath Traveler 2, again, because of its existence as a port from the mobile game. Octopath Traveler 2 looks substantially better than this, and I'm not usually a graphics guy, but it's a noticeable downgrade. Which I only really mention because I love the way Octopath Traveler 2 looks. That is a gorgeous game that does incredible stuff with sprites. Not having that here was a bummer for me personally. There's also like the path action system, which is simpler, the lack of a day-night cycle, stuff like that. So putting all of that together for a conclusion, ultimately Octopath Traveler 0 is a game that is going for $50 US. On one hand, I think if you like older JRPGs or even just the Octopath Traveler series generally, you'll probably have a pretty good time with this. I certainly don't think it's a bad game. I also just don't think it's as good as the second game was. I think it's also got issues with things like pacing and balancing that make playing through the entire thing a really big slog, to be honest. And so ultimately, Octopath Traveler 0 is a port of a mobile game, and it feels like one more often than it doesn't. And so, at the end of the day, personally, I'd have to give this one a buy on sale. I would have been happy to pay like $30, $35 for it, but at $50 and everything else I've gone over in the course of this review, I think that's just a bridge too far for me personally, which then results in the rating. So, I think that's going to do it for this review. That's just about everything I've got to say about this one, and to that end, I certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know how you feel about this one down in the comment section below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.